Imagine stepping into a place where the fog never lifts and the stones remember screaming, where the air itself seems to swallow sound, leaving only the whisper of wind through iron bars and the distant echo of footsteps that stopped walking decades ago. This is Bodmin Moor, and buried in its highest ground is a machine that cost the equivalent of $10 million to build, not to house criminals, but to break human souls with scientific precision. For 148 years, this place processed 3,877 human beings through a system so perfectly designed that only 15 died of natural causes. The rest simply disappeared. Not through escape, but through something far more systematic, something far more terrifying. They were transformed into lessons, living lessons in the workshops, dead lessons at the gallows, all part of Sir John Call's clean machine. But here's what the tourist brochures won't tell you. The building was designed by a military engineer who believed suffering could be measured in cubic feet. The walls were built by French prisoners of war, captives constructing their own nightmare. And in the deepest corner of the blueprint, tucked away like an accounting footnote, were cells measuring exactly 10 feet by 8 by 9, mathematical volumes for human beings in their final days. Today, we're opening the files that were never meant to be opened. We're walking through spaces that were designed to make people disappear, and we're uncovering the most chilling truth of all. This place succeeded so completely at its real purpose that we forgot what that purpose was. Until now. If you've ever wondered what happens when humanitarian language masks systematic horror, when reform becomes a weapon, when mercy is measured in gallons per day, then you need to hear this story. Because Bodmin Jail isn't just history. It's a blueprint, and that blueprint is still being used today. The moor breathes fog like a wounded animal. Low clouds roll across Bodmin Moor in waves, swallowing landmarks, erasing horizons, making the familiar suddenly foreign. This is not gentle English countryside. This is something older, hungrier. The air itself seems to muffle sound here, absorbing footsteps, conversation, even the beating of hearts, until all that remains is the whisper of wet wind through gorse and the distant bleat of sheep lost in their own landscape. Cornwall has always known how to hide things. Tin mines honeycomb the earth beneath your feet. Ancient stone circles mark forgotten rituals, and here where the moor rises to its highest ground, where the fog comes and goes like a curtain drawn by invisible hands, something else was hidden in plain sight for nearly 2 centuries. A machine built to break human beings. A factory of despair wrapped in the language of reform. A place where mercy became measurement, where hope was rationed by the cubic foot, where the very stones were taught to remember screaming. The locals call it Bodmin Jail, but that name carries too much weight now, too much history, too much blood. Better to start with what came before the name. Better to start with the ground itself and ask a simpler question. Why here? Why this particular patch of moorland? Why this exact spot where the wind never stops and the fog never quite clears, and the nearest neighbor is always too far away to hear what happens after dark? The answer is written in the geography itself. High ground means visibility. Exposure means isolation. Control of approach roads means control of everything that moves in a 20-mile radius. This isn't poetry choosing this spot. This is strategy. This is someone thinking like a general, like an engineer, like a man who understands that location is destiny. The fog rolls in again, as if summoned, and for a moment the world shrinks to arm's length. You could disappear here, and no one would think it strange. Things disappear on the moor all the time. Sheep wander into bogs. Hikers lose their way. Ancient settlements vanish beneath bracken and heather. Disappearing is what the moor does. Disappearing is normal here, which makes it the perfect place to build something designed to make human beings disappear without them ever leaving at all. But fog is just water suspended in air. Physics, not metaphor. The real hiding happens in the archives, in the careful language of official reports, in the gap between what was planned and what was built, between what was promised and what was delivered. The fog lifts eventually. The paperwork endures forever, and there, buried in a document dated June 1779, is the first hard fact that refuses to hide. A prison first inhabited, not opened, not dedicated, inhabited. As if the building itself were a living thing that needed to be fed, which, as it turns out, was exactly what it was. But every machine needs a maker. Every system needs a designer. Every nightmare needs an architect who believes, truly believes, that he is building something beautiful. Sir John Call had clean hands and a military mind, a magistrate by appointment, an engineer by training, a reformer by inclination. He thought in straight lines and right angles, in problems that could be solved with sufficient planning, sufficient materials, sufficient will. The world, to Sir John Call, was a blueprint waiting to be improved. He had seen the old ways of keeping prisoners. He had walked through the fetid cells of ancient jails where humans were warehoused like grain sacks, where disease spread faster than rumor, where the strong preyed on the weak and the weak simply died. He had read the reports of John Howard, that tireless inspector of misery who had measured the exact dimensions of despair across England and found them wanting. Sir John Call believed he could do better. Sir John Call believed in the perfectibility of systems. His design was revolutionary in its humanity. Individual cells to prevent the corruption of association, segregation by sex and class to protect the vulnerable, healthcare facilities to preserve life, clean water piped to every ward, fresh air circulated through every corner. This would not be a place where human beings rotted in their own filth. This would be a place where human beings were scientifically, methodically, humanely reformed. The blueprint was a thing of beauty. Clean lines dividing space into functional units. Courtyards stacked on different levels, connected by stone steps that would exhaust the legs while feeding the lungs. Workshops where idle hands could learn honest trades. Day rooms where bodies could exercise while minds contemplated their crimes. An infirmary where the sick could heal. A chapel where souls could repent. Every detail calculated, every angle measured, every surface planned to serve the grand project of transformation. But blueprints are just lines on paper until someone builds them, and Sir John Call's builders were an irony that the blueprint could not account for. French prisoners of war, captives constructing captivity, men who knew the weight of chains building a machine to forge new chains. They worked under armed guard, these enemies of the crown, laying stone upon stone to create a place where other enemies of order would spend years, decades, lifetimes, learning that the crown's reach was longer and stronger than any wall could contain. Did they understand what they were building? Did they see the condemned cells taking shape and recognize the mathematics of judicial murder? Did they feel the weight of the keystones they set, knowing those arches would frame final moments for human beings not yet born? The French prisoners left no memoirs of their labor. They built in silence and departed in silence, leaving behind only their work. Only the stones themselves, fitted so perfectly that centuries later no mortar had failed, no wall had shifted, no joint had given way. But the greatest achievement of Sir John Call's design was not the stones or the mortar. It was the water, a constant current distributed through every ward. Life-giving, life-sustaining water flowing on command to every corner of the compound. Clean water for drinking, clean water for washing, clean water for the endless battle against disease and despair. Control of water is control of life itself. The jailer who can turn a valve can decide who drinks and who goes thirsty, who bathes and who festers, who lives and who dies by inches in the summer heat. Sir John Call had built a machine where mercy flowed through pipes and compassion was measured in gallons per day, where the most basic human need became the most powerful tool of human control. And if water was life, what did it mean that the water supply was designed, from the very beginning, to serve condemned cells? What did it mean that a man's last drink would come through the same system that watered the workshops and the day rooms and the infirmary? What did it mean that the blueprint made no distinction between the water that sustained hope and the water that accompanied despair? The machine was taking shape. Not just the building, but the system. Not just the walls, but the way those walls would be used to reshape human souls. Sir John Call's clean machine, built by captive hands, fed by controlled water, ready to begin the great work of reform. But first, someone had to measure the cage, 180 feet by 145 feet. Those are the dimensions of certainty. The boundary wall that defines inside from outside, prisoner from citizen, hope from hopelessness. Not round numbers chosen for convenience. Exact measurements, surveyed and calculated to contain precisely the amount of human misery the system was designed to process. 38,700 square feet of enclosed space. Picture it. Pace it out. An area smaller than a single football field, but divided and subdivided into yards and courts and passages, each one designed for a specific function, each one serving the greater machine of transformation. The geometry of control made visible in brick and stone. The land itself helped with the design. Steep ground falling away on all sides, natural drainage keeping the yards dry, elevation providing the jailer with commanding views of every approach. But the terrain created its own challenges. Yards had to be stacked on different levels, connected by stone steps that climbed and descended like some industrial mountain path. Movement between areas became deliberate, exhausting, observable. A prisoner walking from workshop to day room would feel the climb in his legs, the burn in his lungs, the constant reminder that every step was controlled, every breath permitted. The design was proud of its innovations. Sunlight and fresh air, those twin healers of body and spirit, given free access to every corner of the complex. As if physics could rehabilitate morals, as if the mere presence of clean air and natural light could scrub the corruption from criminal souls. The blueprint showed windows facing every direction, courtyards open to the sky, walls designed to channel breezes rather than trap stagnant air. But sunlight reveals as much as it heals. And the higher you climb through Sir John Call's geometric paradise, the more clearly you can see the corner of the plan that the architect never wanted visitors to notice, tucked away like an accounting footnote, drawn with the same careful precision as the workshops and day rooms, but marked with different words, different purposes, different expectations, the condemned cells, the waiting rooms, the place where reform ended and justice began its final calculation. The blueprint shows them clearly, once you know where to look. 10 feet by 8 feet by 9 feet high to the crown of the arch. Not rough approximations, but exact measurements. The precise volume allotted to a human being in his final days. 38 cubic feet per condemned soul, calculated with the same engineering precision that determined water flow rates and ventilation patterns. The inventory of mercy was equally precise. Loose straw for the floor, 2 blankets for warmth, a rug for what little comfort wool could provide, brick floors that could be swept clean of whatever human debris accumulated during the wait, iron-grated windows looking out onto a passage 3 feet and 6 inches wide, just enough room for a guard to patrol, just enough space for last conversations between the condemned and the world they were leaving behind. The cells were not afterthoughts. They were integral to the design, positioned near the infirmary court where health and death could be administered as adjacent departments. The condemned could receive medical attention if they fell ill during their wait. The condemned could be examined by physicians to ensure they were fit for execution. The condemned could be measured and weighed so that their hanging could be calculated with scientific precision. Because if the condemned cells were engineered into the building from the very beginning, then execution was never a failure of the reform system. Execution was a feature of the reform system, the final proof that some human beings were beyond the reach of Sir John Call's clean machine, the ultimate demonstration that the system had tried everything else first. But machines require maintenance. Systems require oversight. Even the most beautifully designed blueprint cannot run itself. And by 1788, barely a decade after the first prisoner was admitted, the reports were already troubling. John Howard himself had returned to inspect his ideals made manifest. The great reformer whose writings had inspired Sir John Call's humanitarian revolution walked through the completed prison and found that reality had already begun to corrupt the dream. Cleanliness was slipping. Windows lacked proper casements. leaving cells vulnerable to wind and rain. Women were crowded together in spaces while other rooms stood empty, their original purposes forgotten or ignored. The problem was not architectural. The design remained sound. The problem was human. The jailer's salary was inadequate for the responsibilities required. The staff were overworked and underpaid, forced to take on many avocations beyond their prison duties just to survive. Order depended on hands that could barely feed their own families. Control depended on guards who had to leave their posts to earn money elsewhere. The hierarchy of desperation was built into the budget. At the top, the jailer struggling to maintain order while watching his authority erode with every empty pocket. Below him, turnkeys and guards choosing between their families' hunger and their prisoners' security. At the bottom, the prisoners themselves, beginning to understand that the system designed to reform them was itself in need of reform. The machine was drifting, not dramatically, not catastrophically, but steadily, inevitably, like a ship with a hull breach so small that the water enters drop by drop, hour by hour, until one day the deck is awash and the crew finally notices they are sinking. But machines that drift can still function. Systems that decay can still process their inputs and produce their outputs. And Sir John Call's clean machine was about to prove its fundamental purpose not through its ability to reform human souls, but through its capacity to count human bodies. The ledger of bodies began with the first admission in June 1779 and continued without interruption for decades. Every name recorded, every crime catalogued, every entry and exit documented with clerical precision. The bureaucracy of human misery reduced to columns and categories, sorted by type of offense, length of sentence, condition upon release, commitments across jail and bridewell, debtors and felons, petty offenders and hardened criminals, men and women, adults and children. The machine accepted all inputs without discrimination, processed them according to predetermined procedures, and delivered outputs measured in days served, trades learned, health preserved, lives saved. The health preservation ideal became routine. Strip the arriving prisoner of his contaminated clothing. Scrub his body clean of the filth of the outside world. Issue him fresh county clothing, uniform in design and color, marking him immediately as property of the system. Sanitation as control ritual. Cleanliness as the first step in the long process of erasing the individual and replacing him with the reformed prisoner. The numbers told their own story. Over 27 years, 3,877 prisoners passed through Sir John Call's machine. Of those, 15 died. A mortality rate so low it bordered on the miraculous. Proof that the building could keep bodies alive, could maintain health, could preserve life even under conditions of confinement that would have killed hundreds in the old jails. But survival was not the same as safety, and keeping a body alive was not the same as keeping a soul intact. The ledger recorded deaths, but it did not record despair. It counted days served, but it did not measure dreams destroyed. It tracked health preservation, but it did not calculate the cost of that preservation to the human spirit. The machine worked. The machine kept people alive. The machine processed its inputs efficiently and delivered its outputs on schedule. But the machine had learned something that Sir John Call had never intended to teach it. The machine had learned that survival was not enough, that a human being could be kept alive and healthy and fed and clothed, while still being destroyed utterly. That the most effective way to break a human spirit was not to kill the body, but to preserve it, while slowly, methodically, scientifically removing everything that made that body human. And now the machine was ready to add a second product to its output. Not just reform, not just preservation of life, but public demonstration of the price of defying the system. The machine was ready to kill. The front gate gallows were not an afterthought. They were not a corruption of the reform ideal. They were the reform ideal made visible, transformed from theory into practice, from blueprint into blood. Because what was the point of preserving life so carefully inside the walls if that life could not be taken just as carefully when the time came? September 1st, 1802. The date when Sir John Call's clean machine added judicial murder to its list of services. The date when the front gate of the prison became a theater, the condemned cells became backstage, and the crowd became an audience for the final act of the reform process. The logic was impeccable. If imprisonment was supposed to deter crime, how much more would execution deter crime? If the sight of prisoners laboring in the yards was supposed to inspire law-abiding behavior in the general population, how much more inspiring would be the sight of a prisoner dancing at the end of a rope? If the prison was supposed to serve as a visible reminder of the consequences of criminal behavior, what could be more visible than a man dying in full view of anyone who cared to watch? The machine had found its perfect synthesis: life and death, reform and retribution, hope and horror, all contained within the same walls, all proceeding from the same principles, all justified by the same humanitarian language that had made the prison possible in the first place. The first body fell on a September morning when the fog was lifting, and the crowd could see clearly what justice looked like when it was executed with proper engineering precision. The machine worked perfectly. The condemned cell had preserved the prisoner's health right up to the moment of his death. The platform was solid, the rope was strong, the drop was calculated to ensure a quick, clean kill. And the crowd cheered. Because the machine had taught them to cheer. Because the machine had shown them that death, like reform, could be accomplished humanely, scientifically, with proper attention to procedure and protocol. Because the machine had convinced them that they were witnessing progress. But machines that work tend to work more often. Systems that prove their effectiveness tend to expand their operations. And Sir John Call's clean machine, having tasted blood, discovered that it had developed an appetite for more. The logistics of death became standardized with the efficiency that Sir John Call would have admired. Scaffolds built to precise specifications, designed for quick assembly and reliable operation. Drop methods calculated to ensure that death was swift, that the body's final convulsions would provide proper spectacle without unseemly prolongation of suffering. Crowd management transformed into an engineering problem of sightlines and choke points, of walls repurposed as grandstands and approach roads that could handle the traffic of thousands come to witness justice. Timing became critical. Too early and the fog might still shroud the moor, denying the crowd their clear view of the proceedings. Too late, and the autumn rains might drive spectators away before the lesson could be properly delivered. The perfect execution required perfect weather, perfect visibility, perfect conditions for the maximum educational impact. The prison's authority was proved by spectacle. Each successful hanging demonstrated the reach of the law, the inevitability of justice, the futility of resistance. The machine had learned to use death as advertisement, to transform judicial murder into public relations, to convert the final moments of human life into propaganda for the system that had made those moments necessary. But spectacle breeds appetite, not obedience. The crowd that came to learn lessons about law and order learned different lessons entirely. They learned that death could be entertaining. They learned that suffering could be scheduled. They learned that the state's power was most visible, most tangible, most real when it was ending a human life in full view of anyone who cared to watch. And they always came back for more. Because the machine had taught them that death was a show worth watching, that justice was a drama worth attending, that the final moments of a condemned prisoner's life were worth traveling miles to witness. The machine had created its own audience, its own demand, its own market for the product it was designed to deliver. The crowd was no longer just witnessing the machine's work. The crowd had become part of the machine. But even machines need fuel to function. Even systems designed for human transformation need raw materials to transform. And Sir John Call's clean machine had discovered the most reliable fuel of all: human labor. The humane machine demanded work, not as punishment, but as rehabilitation, not as cruelty, but as kindness. The idle hands that had turned to crime would be taught honest trades. The empty minds that had conceived criminal thoughts would be filled with useful knowledge. The bodies that had been weakened by vice would be strengthened by virtuous labor. The double saw pit became the heart of the workshop system. Two prisoners working the great saw, one standing above the timber, one laboring in the pit below, cutting planks with the rhythm that had shaped English carpentry for centuries. The work was hard, honest, useful. The timber they cut would build houses, furniture, tools. The prisoners would learn skills they could use when their sentences ended. The system would profit from their labor while teaching them the value of honest work. Women carded and spun wool with the same patient attention their grandmothers had brought to the task. They washed and mended clothing, learning domestic skills that would make them better wives, better mothers, better citizens when they returned to the world. Their hands, which had perhaps stolen or struck or signed fraudulent documents, would remember the rhythm of useful work, the satisfaction of tasks completed, the pride of products well made. The economics were engineered as carefully as the buildings. Earnings were split according to a formula that rewarded effort while funding the system. The keeper took his portion to offset the costs of housing and feeding the prisoners. The prisoners kept enough to motivate continued effort and to provide a small fund for their release. The balance supported the workshops, purchased raw materials, maintained the equipment that made the work possible. Incentives were designed to manufacture compliance. Good work meant better food, better quarters, earlier release. Poor work meant reduced privileges, extended sentences, transfer to less desirable assignments. The prisoners learned that cooperation paid, literally and figuratively. They learned that the system could be generous to those who served it faithfully and harsh to those who resisted its wisdom. But the most powerful incentive was hope. Hope that work could lead to freedom. Hope that skills learned in prison could provide honest employment outside. Hope that the system's promise of transformation might actually be true, that human beings could be reformed through patient application of enlightened principles. One prisoner called his commitment the most fortunate day of his life because he learned a trade that supported him for decades afterward. His gratitude was genuine, his transformation real. The machine had worked exactly as Sir John Call had designed it to work. A human being had entered the system corrupt and emerged reformed, had traded criminal habits for honest skills, had exchanged a life of vice for a life of virtue. But rehabilitation was an accidental side effect of coercion. The prisoner was grateful not because the system was designed to help him, but because he was fortunate enough to benefit from a system designed to control him. His transformation was real, but it was not the system's primary purpose. The system's primary purpose was to maintain itself, to justify its existence, to prove that the enormous expense of building and operating a prison could be offset by the value of the work its inmates performed. The workshops were profitable. The prisoners were productive. The system was working exactly as intended, which raised a troubling question. If work could reform criminals, if honest labor could transform corrupt souls, if useful skills could replace criminal habits, then why did the system keep needing more space? By 1820, the answer was written in the walls themselves. The individual cells that had been the pride of Sir John Call's humanitarian design were housing 2 prisoners, 3 prisoners, sometimes 4 or more. The careful segregation that was supposed to prevent the corruption of association had been abandoned. The reformative isolation that was supposed to allow contemplation and repentance had become involuntary intimacy with fellow criminals. Overcrowding was rewriting the blueprint in real time. Spaces designed for single occupancy were subdivided, partitioned, packed with as many bodies as could physically fit. The reform ideal that had justified the prison's construction was being sacrificed to the simple mathematics of supply and demand. More criminals were being sentenced than the system could house according to its original specifications. Extensions got bolted onto the original structure like afterthoughts, like patches on a coat that had grown too small for its wearer. New wings, new yards, new workshops, new cells, all constructed with the same careful attention to humanitarian principles, all destined to be overcrowded from the moment they were completed. Segregation requirements expanded as the legal system developed more sophisticated categories of criminal. Remand prisoners had to be separated from convicted prisoners. Felons had to be separated from vagrants. Men had to be separated from women. Children had to be separated from adults. Each new category required new spaces, new facilities, new staff, new expenses. The machine that had been designed to reform individual criminals through individual treatment was becoming a factory for processing criminal populations through mass techniques. The careful attention to personal transformation that had justified the enormous expense of individual cells was being replaced by the efficient management of human inventory. The reform ideal was flipping. The prison that had pioneered separation to prevent criminal contamination was becoming a mixing chamber where every category of offender encountered every other category, where petty thieves learned from hardened felons, where young criminals received education from experienced ones, where the system designed to prevent criminal association was creating criminal networks more sophisticated than any that had existed on the outside. But the most dangerous transformation was not in the prisoners. The most dangerous transformation was in the system itself. Because when bodies exceeded design capacity, when human beings were packed into spaces calculated for smaller numbers, when the infrastructure of reform was overwhelmed by the demands of mere containment, then the building's humane systems became stress points. Air that was calculated to serve a specific number of lungs became foul when those lungs were doubled or tripled. Water that was designed to serve predetermined populations became inadequate when those populations exceeded predictions. Sanitation systems that functioned perfectly under planned conditions began to fail when unplanned conditions overwhelmed their capacity. The machine was discovering the difference between design limits and operating limits. Sir John Call's careful calculations had been based on specific assumptions about how many prisoners the system would house, for how long, under what conditions. Those assumptions were being tested by reality, and reality was proving that the assumptions had been optimistic. But the most revealing test was not in the statistics of overcrowding or the mathematics of exceeded capacity. The most revealing test was in the daily experience of movement through the system, in the careful choreography of surveillance that Sir John Call had built into every stone. Walk the stacked courtyards and feel the precision of control made manifest. The men's Bridewell Court measured 62 feet by 47 feet, large enough for exercise, small enough for observation. The women's courts, 62 by 20, provided space proportional to their smaller numbers, while ensuring that no corner remained hidden from the jailer's watch. Day rooms sheltered under stone arcades where prisoners could gather when weather drove them inside, their conversations easily monitored, their associations carefully observed. Workshops positioned to catch natural light for productive work while providing clear sightlines for security. Passages connecting every area, every function, every moment of the day, ensuring that movement was controlled, predictable, observable. The infrastructure told the story that the official reports preferred to obscure. Baths and boilers for washing bodies and purifying clothes, but also for demonstrating the system's power to command even the most intimate human activities. Ovens for cooking food, but also for destroying contaminated materials that might carry disease or contraband. Troughs and taps feeding each ward with the water that meant life, but also with the reminder that life itself was subject to the system's control. The jailer's house occupied the central position with mathematical precision, its turret providing commanding views of every courtyard, every workshop, every area where prisoners might gather, the alarm bell that could summon help or announce escape attempts, the clock that divided the day into regulated segments, that transformed time itself into an instrument of control. Time was the final guard. Not just the passage of days and weeks and months that marked the length of sentences, but the division of each day into segments that could be measured, monitored, controlled. Wake-up bells and meal bells and work bells and sleep bells, creating a rhythm that replaced the natural rhythms of hunger and fatigue with artificial rhythms of institutional convenience. The machine was loud in theory, bells marking every transition, clocks announcing every hour, rules governing every activity, the constant noise of institutionalized order, of human life reduced to schedule, of individual will subordinated to systematic routine. But the loudest sound was silence. The silence that fell over 25,000 people when the trapdoor opened and the rope went tight. The silence that proved the machine's ultimate power was not the power to create noise, but the power to command absolute attention, absolute focus, absolute acknowledgement of its authority over human life and death. April 13, 1840, a date that proves the machine had learned to count more than bodies. It had learned to count witnesses. 25,000 souls gathered on the moor to watch the Lightfoot brothers die, drawn by word of mouth and newspaper announcements, and the simple human appetite for spectacle that the machine had learned to feed. The crowd was so large that trains had to be halted below the prison wall so passengers could disembark and find vantage points for the show. The railway companies discovered that executions were good for business, that scheduled hangings could fill cars that would otherwise travel empty, that death was a destination worth paying to reach. Crowd control became an engineering problem more complex than any that Sir John Call had solved in his original blueprint. Lines of sight had to be calculated so that maximum numbers of spectators could witness the proceedings. Choke points had to be identified and managed to prevent dangerous crushing. Walls had to be reinforced to serve as grandstands for the thousands who would climb them for better views. The prison's authority was proved by spectacle, but spectacle was proving to have its own authority. The machine had created something larger than itself, something that demanded feeding, something that had developed appetites the machine was struggling to satisfy. The crowd was no longer coming to learn lessons about law and order. The crowd was coming to be entertained, and entertainment, once provided, becomes expected. The machine had taught 25,000 people that it could deliver a show worth traveling to see, worth paying to witness, worth remembering and discussing and anticipating. Those 25,000 people became 25,000 advertisements for the machine's power, 25,000 testimonies to the system's ability to deliver satisfaction to its audience. But appetites grow with feeding. Spectacle that satisfies today requires more spectacle tomorrow. The machine was discovering that it had created a market for its product, and markets have their own demands, their own pressures, their own logic that can overwhelm the original purposes they were designed to serve. The system that had started with the humanitarian goal of reforming criminals had evolved into a system that existed to feed the appetite of crowds for the sight of criminals dying. The machine was no longer primarily serving justice. The machine was serving entertainment. And entertainment, unlike justice, can never be fully satisfied. But even the most successful entertainment can outlive its audience. Even the most profitable spectacle can become a liability. And by 1850, barely 3 decades after the first public execution, the machine was being forced to acknowledge that its greatest success had become its greatest failure. Despite all the additions, all the extensions, all the patches and modifications and improvements, Bodmin was declared unfit for purpose. The official admission that patchwork had failed, that the humanitarian machine had become an inhumane warehouse, that the system designed to solve the problem of criminality had become part of the problem it was supposed to solve. But declaring a system unfit for purpose is not the same as abandoning the system. The machine had developed too much momentum, created too many jobs, served too many functions to be simply discontinued. The fix was not elimination but escalation, not smaller but larger, not simpler but more complex. The solution was radical in its scope and conservative in its logic. Overhaul the entire complex toward a 220-cell prison by 1861. Add a new heating system to solve the problems created by overcrowding. Build more workshops to house more productive labor. Create more segregation to prevent the criminal contamination that overcrowding had made inevitable. Reform didn't end punishment. Reform upgraded punishment. More cells meant more capacity to hold more prisoners for longer periods under more carefully controlled conditions. More separation meant more sophisticated techniques for breaking down criminal associations while building up institutional dependencies. More capacity meant more opportunity to perfect the techniques of human transformation that the machine had been developing through trial and error for over half a century. But rebuilding a prison presented the same paradox as rebuilding a ship at sea. Where do you put the prisoners while you replace the walls that hold them? How do you maintain security while destroying the structures that provide security? How do you continue operating a machine while fundamentally altering the machine's design? The answer revealed the true nature of the system Sir John Call had created. The machine was not the building. The machine was not the walls or the cells or the workshops or the gallows. The machine was the idea that human beings could be systematically processed, that criminal behavior could be mechanically corrected, that social problems could be solved through architectural solutions. And ideas, unlike buildings, can survive any amount of reconstruction. Ideas, unlike walls, can be expanded without limit. Ideas, unlike machines, never wear out from use. They only grow stronger with exercise, more sophisticated with experience, more persuasive with each apparent success. The machine was about to rebuild itself. Not just the stones and mortar, but the entire system of assumptions and procedures and techniques that had made those stones and mortar meaningful. The new prison would be better than the old prison the same way the old prison had been better than the jails that preceded it. More humane, more scientific, more effective, more quietly, efficiently, systematically destructive of human dignity and human hope. But first, the machine had to solve the problem of construction. And construction, like every other aspect of the system, would be accomplished through the careful application of human labor under precise institutional control. The prisoners would build their own new cage, just as their predecessors had built the original cage, just as future prisoners would maintain and modify and expand whatever cage was built for them. Because that was what the machine had really learned in its first 70 years of operation. Not how to reform criminals, but how to make criminals complicit in their own confinement. Not how to eliminate crime, but how to make crime serve the interests of the system designed to punish it. The machine was ready to begin its second century of humanitarian progress. April 13th, 1857. The date etched into the cornerstone of a new era. Not just any date, but the same date that 17 years earlier had drawn 25,000 witnesses to watch the Lightfoot brothers die. The machine had learned to mark time with its own rhythms, to create calendars where death and construction occupied the same coordinates, where the anniversary of one form of destruction became the foundation date for another. The present building. That phrase appears in the official records with bureaucratic precision, as if the previous 78 years had been merely preparation, mere rehearsal for what was about to rise from the moorland stone. Construction begins with mathematical certainty on April 13th, a precise start date for a new era of confinement architecture that would perfect everything the old system had learned about containing human souls. But dates carry weight beyond their official functions. April 13th, 1840 had been a day of spectacle when the machine discovered its power to command audiences. April 13th, 1857 would be a day of foundation, when the machine began constructing the infrastructure to make spectacle unnecessary. The coincidence was too precise to be accidental, too symbolic to be mere bureaucratic scheduling. The machine was announcing its continuity. Same date, same principles, same fundamental purpose, but upgraded techniques. The crowd that had gathered to witness death would be replaced by walls that could deliver death in private. The external theater of public execution would be internalized into architectural spaces designed for invisible efficiency. 2 cell blocks rising from the foundation trenches, wings calculated to house different populations, according to more sophisticated taxonomies of human failure. The south wing designated for naval prisoners, because the machine had learned to diversify its customer base, to accept contracts from other institutions, to expand beyond its original mission of reforming local criminals. Offices and chapel occupying the east wing, because the machine had learned that administration and spiritual guidance were as essential as confinement itself. Clerks, to maintain the records that proved the system's efficiency. Chaplains, to provide the moral instruction that justified the system's cruelty. Bureaucrats and ministers working side by side to ensure that both earthly and heavenly authorities approved of what the machine accomplished. But the most revealing detail was not in the blueprint's innovations. The most revealing detail was in its repetitions. April 13th as the construction date, echoing April 13th as the execution date. The machine's calendar looping back on itself, creating patterns that proved its operations were not random responses to criminal behavior, but deliberate exercises in institutional memory. The machine remembered its successes and built upon them. The machine learned from its failures and corrected them. The machine evolved not through external pressure, but through internal logic, developing more sophisticated techniques for accomplishing the same fundamental purpose that Sir John Call had established almost 8 decades earlier. The purpose was control, not reform, despite the humanitarian language, not deterrence, despite the public executions, not rehabilitation, despite the workshops and training programs, control, pure, systematic, scientific control of human behavior through the careful manipulation of human environment. The new prison would be better at control. More cells meant more capacity for individual isolation, when isolation served institutional purposes. Better heating meant more comfortable prisoners, when comfort served institutional efficiency. Improved infrastructure meant fewer breakdowns, fewer disruptions, fewer opportunities for prisoners to exploit system weaknesses. But better control created its own problems, because the machine was about to discover that Parliament could change the rules of the game faster than architects could design new playing fields. By 1861, the rebuilt complex achieved its numerical target: 220 cells, each one a precisely measured unit of confinement, each one designed to hold exactly one prisoner under exactly specified conditions for exactly predetermined purposes. A numerical victory that proved the machine could plan, execute, and deliver architectural solutions to social problems. But numbers lie when they measure the wrong things. 220 cells meant space for 220 prisoners, but it did not mean space for 220 human beings, because human beings require more than cells. They require hope, dignity, purpose, connection to something larger than the institutional routine that divides their days into segments of controlled activity. The heating systems promised fewer defects, more predictability, more comfort for the inhabitants of the machine's new architecture. But comfort repurposed as efficiency serves different purposes than comfort provided for humanitarian reasons. Warm cells meant healthy prisoners who could work longer hours, serve longer sentences, generate more profit from their labor. Comfort became another tool of control, another technique for extracting maximum value from human inventory. The infrastructure improvements were real, the enhanced capacity was measurable, the better conditions were documented in official reports that proved the machine's commitment to humanitarian progress. But bigger did not mean safer. Bigger meant the institution could absorb more human misery before anyone on the outside noticed that the misery was increasing rather than decreasing. The machine had learned the most important lesson of institutional survival: how to grow without appearing to grow, how to expand capacity without appearing to expand cruelty, how to increase efficiency without acknowledging that the product being efficiently produced was human suffering. But growth creates its own momentum. Institutions that expand successfully develop appetites for continued expansion. Systems that prove their capacity to handle larger populations attract larger populations to handle. The machine's success was about to generate demand that would test its ability to maintain the humanitarian fiction that had made its success possible. And then, Parliament changed the rules. 1868, the year public hangings were abolished. Not eliminated, just privatized, moved from the external theater of front gate gallows to the internal theater of purpose-built execution chambers. The crowd that had provided the machine with its most powerful validation was being dismissed. The spectacle that had proved the system's authority was being declared unnecessary. But the machine had learned to adapt. Adaptation was what the machine did best. Every challenge became an opportunity to demonstrate superior techniques, more sophisticated approaches, more effective methods of accomplishing the same essential purposes. Prisons would build execution pits and execution sheds away from public view. Death would become internal logistics, a problem of space planning and structural engineering rather than crowd management and theatrical timing. The machine would learn to kill quietly, efficiently, without the complications introduced by audiences who might develop inconvenient sympathies or inappropriate reactions. Architecture adapted to law with the same precision that had characterized every previous modification. Execution spaces designed according to specifications that prioritized functional efficiency over public accessibility. Drop chambers calculated to ensure reliable results without external oversight. Viewing areas limited to official witnesses whose reactions could be predicted and controlled. But removing the audience did not remove the violence. It removed accountability through visibility. The machine had discovered that its most controversial function could be performed more effectively without public scrutiny. The death could be delivered more systematically when it was divorced from the messy complications of human observation. The privatization of execution was not an admission of moral doubt. It was a technological upgrade. The machine had learned to accomplish the same results with less political cost, to maintain the same deterrent effect without the public relations problems created by crowds who sometimes sympathized with the condemned rather than celebrating their deaths. But if execution was to be hidden, it had to be perfected. If death was to be delivered privately, it had to be delivered professionally. The machine was about to discover that invisible cruelty required more sophisticated techniques than visible cruelty. 1872. The year hanging became engineering. William Marwood's long drop method, designed to make death instant rather than prolonged, to transform execution from crude strangulation into precise spinal separation. Death calculated according to mathematical formulas that took into account body weight, rope length, drop distance, and the exact amount of force required to separate vertebrae without decapitating the condemned. Instant death required measurement. Charts and tables correlating physical characteristics with mechanical specifications. Ropes tested for strength and elasticity. Drop chambers calibrated for maximum efficiency. Execution becoming a technical specialty that required training, certification, professional standards of performance. The system's moral language became mechanical. If death could be optimized, it could be called progress. If suffering could be minimized through scientific technique, then the science itself became a form of mercy. If execution could be performed according to objective standards rather than subjective judgments, then the system could claim to have eliminated cruelty even while maintaining its capacity for killing. But the most revealing aspect of the long drop method was not its technical sophistication. The most revealing aspect was its psychological purpose. Instant death was not designed to benefit the condemned, who would be equally dead regardless of how quickly they died. Instant death was designed to benefit the executioners, the witnesses, the officials who had to watch professional killing performed according to professional standards. The machine was learning to manage the emotional costs of its operations, to reduce the psychological burden on the personnel required to operate the system, to maintain staff morale while maintaining staff efficiency, to ensure that the human beings responsible for delivering death could continue delivering death without developing inconvenient doubts about their work, because the machine had identified its most dangerous vulnerability. Not external opposition from critics who questioned the morality of institutional killing, not political pressure from reformers who wanted to abolish capital punishment entirely, but internal resistance from the staff who had to perform the actual work of killing human beings under controlled conditions. The long drop method solved that problem by transforming executioners into technicians, men who operated machinery rather than men who killed people, professionals who followed procedures rather than individuals who made life and death decisions. The machine had learned to distribute responsibility so thoroughly that no single person had to feel fully accountable for the results. But technical progress created new opportunities for institutional expansion. Better methods attracted new customers. Superior techniques generated demand for additional services. The machine was about to discover that success in one area of operation could justify expansion into completely different areas of operation. 1878 to 1922. The years of the naval wing. Military prisoners housed according to military discipline within civilian penal architecture. Different uniforms, different routines, different expectations, but the same fundamental purpose of systematic control through systematic confinement. The addition of naval prisoners represented more than simple diversification of the machine's customer base. It represented the machine's evolution from local institution to regional resource, from specialized facility to general-purpose solution for any organization that needed difficult people contained and controlled. Different discipline systems collided within the same walls. Civilian penal routines designed to break criminal habits encountered naval order designed to maintain military hierarchy. The resulting friction generated new techniques, new approaches, new methods for managing populations that required different forms of control. But collision also generated innovation. The machine learned to operate multiple systems simultaneously, to segregate different populations while maintaining overall efficiency, to customize its techniques without compromising its fundamental principles. Naval prisoners taught the machine that human control could take many forms while serving the same essential purposes. The machine was expanding its mission because machines hate shrinking. Institutions resist downsizing. Systems seek new customers when their original customer base becomes insufficient to justify continued operation. The naval contract proved that the machine's techniques were applicable beyond their original scope, that the principles developed for criminal reform could serve military discipline, that the architecture of confinement could house any population that required systematic management. But expansion created new vulnerabilities. Multiple customer bases meant multiple sources of oversight. Different populations meant different standards of treatment. Various contracts meant various obligations that might conflict with each other or with the machine's own institutional interests. The machine was learning to manage complexity, but complexity was also learning to manage the machine. Because every new function created new requirements, new expectations, new ways for the system to fail to meet the standards it had promised to maintain. And modernity was bringing more than new inmates. Modernity was bringing new technologies, new materials, new infrastructure that would preserve the evidence of the machine's operations long after the machine itself had forgotten what those operations were designed to accomplish. Many 19th century features remain in place today, embedded in the stone and iron like archaeological evidence of institutional memory. Gong and bell fittings that once regulated the rhythms of confined life. Original gaslights that illuminated the final evolution of Sir John Call's humanitarian vision. Shelves built into cell walls where prisoners stored their few possessions. Hooks for hammocks where naval personnel slept according to shipboard tradition. These are not museum props installed for tourist education. These are the mechanical residue of daily life, the physical evidence of how human beings actually lived within the machine's architecture. Wake-up systems that divided night from day according to institutional convenience rather than natural rhythms. Lighting systems that extended the machine's surveillance capabilities into hours when darkness would otherwise have provided privacy. Storage systems that reduced personal possessions to items small enough to fit on institutionally provided shelves. Sleeping systems that reminded naval prisoners that even their rest was subject to military regulation, adapted to civilian architecture. The surviving hardware tells stories that official reports preferred not to record. Stories about the actual experience of confinement rather than the theoretical purposes of confinement. Stories about how human beings adapted to systematic control rather than how systematic control adapted human beings. Each gong and bell fitting represents thousands of wake-up calls that divided thousands of nights from thousands of days for thousands of prisoners over thousands of mornings. Each gaslight represents thousands of hours when artificial illumination extended the machine's operating capacity beyond the limits imposed by natural daylight. Each shelf represents thousands of inventories of personal possessions, thousands of inspections to ensure that prisoners possessed only what the system permitted them to possess. Each hammock hook represents thousands of nights when sleep itself was subject to institutional regulation, when rest became another activity controlled by systematic procedures. But the most significant aspect of the surviving hardware is not its individual functions. The most significant aspect is its collective testimony to the machine's fundamental character, because these mechanical details were not afterthoughts added to serve convenience. They were integral elements of a system designed to control human behavior through control of human environment. The gaslights were not installed to provide illumination for humanitarian purposes. They were installed to extend the machine's surveillance capabilities, to ensure that darkness could not provide prisoners with opportunities to escape oversight. to maintain systematic observation during hours when supervision would otherwise have been impossible. The storage shelves were not provided to respect prisoners' personal property. They were designed to limit personal property to quantities and types that served institutional purposes, to reduce individual identity to items small enough to fit in institutionally designated spaces. The hammock hooks were not installed to provide comfortable sleeping accommodations for naval prisoners. They were designed to remind military personnel that even their rest was subject to systematic regulation, that sleep itself was another activity controlled by institutional procedures. The surviving hardware reveals the crisis that would ultimately destroy the machine, not a crisis of dramatic failure, not a crisis of violent uprising, not a crisis of external opposition, a crisis of longevity. The building lasted long enough for its cruelty to become normal, for its techniques to become routine, for its purposes to become invisible even to the people who operated the system. The crisis was not that the machine failed to accomplish its mission. The crisis was that the machine accomplished its mission so thoroughly, so completely, so systematically that no one could remember what the mission had originally been designed to accomplish. Normal was breaking in the early 1900s, not with fire or riot or revolutionary violence, but with emptiness. The machine was beginning to starve, not from lack of resources, but from lack of purpose, not from external attack, but from internal obsolescence. The institution that had grown by accepting new customers, new contracts, new populations to control was about to discover that growth had limits, that expansion could not continue indefinitely, that even the most successful machine could outlive the conditions that had made its success necessary. The machine was about to learn the difference between temporary usefulness and permanent necessity. And that difference would prove to be the difference between institutional survival and institutional extinction. 1911, the year the women disappeared first. Not through escape or riot or violent resistance, but through bureaucratic decision. The women's section simply closed, its function discontinued, its population transferred elsewhere. Gender segregation, that fundamental principle of Sir John Call's humanitarian design, ended not with moral revelation, but with mathematical calculation. The numbers no longer justified the expense. Female criminality had not been eliminated by decades of systematic reform, but it had been redistributed. Other institutions, other systems, other approaches had claimed responsibility for managing the women who would once have been housed within these walls. The machine had lost its female customers not to successful rehabilitation, but to institutional competition. But the closure revealed something more disturbing than simple economic obsolescence. The building's design depended on occupancy to justify itself. Empty wings were not just unused space, they were political liabilities. Architecture that stood vacant was architecture that invited questions about whether the original investment had been wise, whether the continuing expense could be justified, whether the machine itself might have outlived its usefulness. The machine was discovering that institutions could fail without chaos, without dramatic collapse, without violent uprising, without external conquest. Institutions could fail by becoming unnecessary, by solving the problems they were designed to solve so effectively that no one remembered why those problems had seemed urgent enough to justify building institutions to solve them. The women's section had worked exactly as designed. Female prisoners had been housed, fed, clothed, trained in useful skills, released as reformed citizens. The system had succeeded completely, which made the system's continuation unnecessary. Success, the machine was learning, could be more dangerous than failure. But the women's disappearance was just the beginning. Empty space has its own momentum. Unused capacity creates pressure for more unused capacity. Buildings that begin to empty tend to continue emptying until someone decides that maintaining empty buildings serves no institutional purpose. The machine was about to learn that success could be temporary, but failure could be permanent. July 1916. The date the last male prisoner was transferred, probably to Plymouth, carrying with him the final civilian purpose that had justified the machine's existence for 137 years. Not released, not paroled, not reformed, but transferred, moved from one institutional system to another institutional system, proving that the machine had not eliminated crime, but had simply redistributed criminals. The transfer was routine, unremarkable, documented with the same bureaucratic precision that had recorded thousands of previous transfers. But this transfer was different. This transfer marked the end of an era, the completion of a historical cycle, the final proof that Sir John Call's humanitarian experiment had run its course. World War I was changing what the state feared most, not individual criminals who could be contained within institutional walls, but organized enemies who could threaten the nation's survival, not local lawbreakers who stole property or committed violent crimes, but foreign armies who could invade territory or destroy national monuments. The machine had been designed to protect society from internal threats, but external threats required different protections, different priorities, different uses for institutional capacity that had been developed over more than a century of experience in containing dangerous people. Dangerous people. The phrase carried new meaning in wartime, not criminals who violated laws, but enemies who threatened existence, not individuals who required reform, but populations who required defeat, not local problems that could be solved through institutional processing, but global problems that required national mobilization. The machine was about to discover that buildings designed to hold dangerous people could be repurposed to protect valuable things, that walls built to contain human threats could be used to shield national treasures, that cells designed for individual prisoners could serve as storage vaults for collective memory. The irony was precise and purposeful. The state trusted the prison's walls more than it trusted the world outside. The same architecture that had contained society's most dangerous individuals would now protect society's most precious possessions. The machine that had guarded against internal enemies would guard against external enemies. During the war, the site stored national treasures including the Domesday Book and the Crown Jewels, documents and objects that defined English identity, English history, English authority. The machine's final success was not reform but secure storage, not the transformation of human souls but the preservation of national symbols. The vault function revealed what the machine had actually been all along, not a reformatory institution designed to improve criminal behavior, but a security system designed to protect social stability. The prisoners had never been the machine's primary purpose. The prisoners had been the machine's raw materials, the inputs required to justify the machine's real function as a guardian of order. But guardianship requires something to guard against. And when the war ended, the external threats that had justified converting the prison into a vault disappeared, along with the internal threats that had justified operating the prison as a reformatory. The machine found itself without enemies to contain and without treasures to protect. What happens to a fortress with no enemy? What happens to a security system when security is no longer threatened? What happens to an institution when the institution's purpose has been accomplished so completely that the purpose itself becomes obsolete? The machine was about to discover that institutions designed to solve temporary problems can outlast the problems they were designed to solve, and institutions that outlast their purposes become problems themselves. 1927 to 1929. The years of official closure and attempted destruction. The prison declared surplus to requirements, auctioned to private bidders, subjected to demolition efforts that included dynamite attacks on walls that had contained human misery for nearly a century and a half. But the machine had been built too well. The French prisoners of war who had constructed the original walls had done their work with such precision that the walls resisted destruction more effectively than they had contained prisoners. Stone that had held together under the pressure of human desperation held together under the explosive force of commercial demolition. The economics of ruin told their own story. Stone had resale value. History did not. The materials that had been quarried and shaped and fitted with such care could be salvaged and sold to builders who needed stone for new construction. The past could be literally dismantled and repurposed to serve present needs. But history resisted economic logic. The building survived violence better than it had contained violence. Walls that had enclosed suffering proved more durable than the suffering they had enclosed. Architecture that had been designed to be temporary proved more permanent than the purposes it had been designed to serve. The destruction efforts failed not because they were technically inadequate, but because they were economically incomplete. Demolition cost more than the salvaged materials were worth. The machine had been constructed so solidly that destroying it properly would have required an investment greater than the value of the materials recovered. Partial demolition left partial ruins, damaged walls, and collapsed roofs and broken windows that transformed the machine from functional institution into Gothic reminder of institutional mortality. The prison became a monument to its own obsolescence, a warning about the temporary nature of permanent solutions. But ruins, like institutions, can find new purposes when their original purposes become obsolete. The destruction didn't end the story. It opened a new chapter: entertainment. By around 1930, the site had discovered its final form. Not as a reformatory, not as a vault, not as a source of salvage materials, but as an attraction. Casino and nightclub and tourist destination where people could pay money to experience the atmosphere of confinement without the reality of confinement. The machine's meaning flipped completely. From deterrence to experience, from punishment to pleasure, from institutional control to commercial entertainment. Fear became a product that could be bought and sold, packaged and marketed, consumed without consequences. But the most corrupted transformation was the staging of mock executions. The machine that had once killed human beings for real was now pretending to kill human beings for fun. The gallows that had delivered actual death were now delivering theatrical death. The system that had operated according to judicial procedures was now operating according to entertainment schedules. This was the final corruption. Punishment removed from ethics and sold as novelty. Justice divorced from law and marketed as amusement. Death separated from meaning and packaged as spectacle. The machine had learned to profit from the memory of its own cruelty without accepting responsibility for that cruelty. The mock executions revealed what the real executions had always been: theater, performance, spectacle designed to satisfy audience appetites rather than serve judicial purposes. The machine had always been in the entertainment business. It had just taken decades to admit that entertainment was its primary function. But tourism, like every other purpose the machine had served, proved temporary. Buildings require maintenance, roofs require replacement, walls require repair, and entertainment revenues were insufficient to support the ongoing costs of maintaining structures that had been built to much higher standards than entertainment required. Once the roof failed, nature and time took over. Weather entered spaces that had been designed to exclude weather. Plants took root in stone that had been designed to exclude life. Animals nested in cells that had been designed to exclude freedom. The machine began to decay according to natural processes rather than institutional procedures. Decay brought its own beauty, ivy covering walls that had never been intended to support plant life. Sunlight streaming through windows that had been designed to control illumination. Silence filling spaces that had echoed with institutional noise for generations. The machine was becoming something it had never been designed to become: peaceful. But even decay was temporary. Even ruin could be renovated. Even obsolete institutions could be repurposed for new generations who had forgotten what those institutions had originally been designed to accomplish. 2021, the year restoration culminated in a modern attraction and hotel era. £65 million invested in transforming the machine into something that could serve contemporary purposes while preserving the appearance of historical authenticity. The original humanitarian monument becoming a curated ruin, its cruelty packaged with lighting and glass and narrative control. But restoration raised philosophical questions that money could not resolve. What did it mean to preserve buildings that had been designed to destroy human dignity? What did it mean to convert cells into hotel rooms, to transform spaces of confinement into spaces of luxury? What did it mean to market historical suffering as contemporary entertainment? The restored prison offered visitors the opportunity to experience historical atmosphere without historical consequences. to sleep in buildings that had once housed condemned prisoners without facing condemnation themselves, to walk through spaces where human beings had suffered without suffering themselves, to consume the aesthetics of institutional control without submitting to institutional authority. The curated experience provided education about historical conditions while carefully avoiding examination of contemporary conditions. Visitors could learn about past cruelty while remaining safely unconscious of present cruelty. They could deplore historical injustices while participating in systems that generated contemporary injustices according to more sophisticated techniques. The restoration was successful because it solved the problem that had always plagued the machine: how to maintain the appearance of humanitarian purpose while serving institutional interests. The modern attraction accomplished what the original prison had never quite managed: complete separation of moral language from practical function. But even restoration could not resolve the fundamental contradictions embedded in the machine's history. The numbers themselves remained contested territory, proof that even the basic facts about institutional violence resisted official control. Two execution counts coexisted in public memory. Promotional histories claimed 55 executions. Specialist databases documented 32 executions between 1802 and 1909. The difference was not academic quibbling over historical details. The difference was evidence that institutions controlled information about their own operations, that official records served institutional purposes rather than historical accuracy. Which number was correct mattered less than why both numbers circulated simultaneously. The machine had learned to manage its own legacy, to control the story told about its operations, to ensure that even historical criticism served contemporary institutional interests. But there was one measurement that could not be disputed, one dimension that remained constant through every historical transformation, every institutional purpose, every architectural modification: 10 feet by 8 feet by 9 feet. The volume of the condemned cell. The space allotted to human beings in their final days: 720 cubic feet. The precise amount of air that surrounded a human being while that human being waited to die according to systematic procedures designed to ensure that death would be delivered efficiently, humanely, scientifically. The exact measurement of the machine's ultimate achievement: the reduction of human existence to geometric calculation. The prison could be renovated, branded, and sold. The walls could be cleaned and lighted and fitted with contemporary conveniences. The cells could be converted into hotel rooms where paying customers could sleep comfortably in spaces where condemned prisoners had spent their final nights. But that volume still existed in the stone. 720 cubic feet of space that had once contained human terror, human despair, human hope that perhaps the system would discover reasons for mercy. That space remembered what it had contained even when everyone else had forgotten. The machine had learned to survive by forgetting its own purposes, by transforming its functions while maintaining its structures, by preserving its appearance while abandoning its principles, by converting its history into entertainment while concealing the lessons that history was supposed to teach. But stones remember what institutions forget. Architecture preserves what administrative records obscure. Physical space maintains the evidence of what happened in that space even when official accounts deny that anything significant happened at all. 10 feet by 8 feet by 9 feet. The measurement that doesn't argue. The dimension that cannot be renovated away, rebranded for contemporary consumption, or converted into comfortable accommodation for tourists who want to experience historical atmosphere without confronting historical reality. That volume exists like a lung that never forgot how to stop breathing, like a heart that continued beating long after the body it served had died, like a memory that preserved the evidence of institutional cruelty even when the institution itself had transformed into something designed to make visitors forget that cruelty had ever been its primary function. The machine had achieved its final victory. Not the elimination of crime, not the reform of criminals, not the protection of society from dangerous individuals. The machine had achieved the elimination of memory, the successful transformation of historical horror into contemporary entertainment, the complete separation of institutional function from institutional accountability. But the stones remained, the measurements endured, the volume persisted. 720 cubic feet of space that had once held human beings who were waiting to die, who were counting their remaining hours, who were hoping against evidence that someone would remember their humanity even when the system had forgotten it. The fog still rolls across Bodmin Moor, swallowing landmarks and erasing horizons, just as it did when Sir John Call first surveyed the site for his humanitarian experiment. The moor still breathes like a wounded animal, still absorbs sound, still makes things disappear. But some things refuse to disappear. Some measurements resist forgetting. Some spaces preserve their memories even when everyone who created those memories has been forgotten. 10 feet by 8 feet by 9 feet, the cage within the cage, the machine within the machine, the human space that measured exactly how much room the system believed a human soul required while waiting for that system to extinguish it forever. The beautiful scar remains, visible from the moor, lighted for contemporary visitors, converted into contemporary purposes, but still containing, in its deepest foundations, in its most carefully measured spaces, the evidence of what human beings are capable of doing to other human beings when they convince themselves that they are doing it for humanitarian reasons. 720 cubic feet, the volume that never forgot how to contain everything that the machine was designed to eliminate. Fear, hope, dignity, love, terror, prayer, and the irreducible human insistence that some things matter more than systematic efficiency. The machine had succeeded completely, and the machine had failed completely, because what it had preserved in its most precisely measured spaces was exactly what it had been designed to destroy: the evidence that human beings are more than the sum of their institutional functions, larger than the systems designed to contain them, and capable of maintaining their humanity even under conditions specifically designed to eliminate it. The fog lifts, the moor appears, the prison stands, and in its deepest foundations, in spaces 10 feet by 8 by 9, the measurement that measures everything the machine could never measure, the exact dimensions of what it means to be human under conditions designed to make humanity impossible.